Welcome to our channel. Today we bring you something truly special, a lecture by the renowned architect Rem Koolhaas. Known for his innovative approach and ability to challenge established norms, Koolhaas takes us on a journey through his architectural thinking and vision for the future of our cities. In this presentation, we will explore Koolhaas's revolutionary ideas, his approach to contemporary urbanization, and his perspective on how architecture can respond to global challenges. Get ready to be inspired by a brilliant mind that continuously redefines the boundaries of architecture. Without further ado, we present Rem Koolhaas. Enjoy. I'm even going to propose a starting hypothesis about Mies van der Rohe, whom we have already discussed in another episode, and Le Corbusier, who was also one of our protagonists in previous videos, will serve as a reference for establishing the dialogue between two of the 21st century's figures. One of them is Norman Foster, whom we will discuss in another episode, who, to some extent, represents the equivalent of Mies van der Rohe in our time. That is, someone who has made technique and the monumentalization of technique his hallmark. On the other hand, Rem Koolhaas is, we could say, and as he has often been compared, the contemporary Le Corbusier. He is an architect dedicated to finding the connections between architecture and contemporary culture and, at the same time, an extraordinary publicist. Just like Le Corbusier, who wrote so many books, Rem Koolhaas has written many as well. His books have been just as important as his buildings. In another episode, we will look at the career of Norman Foster, an extraordinary story of a boy from a working-class neighborhood in Manchester who reached the highest social, professional, and economic levels. With an office employing more than 1,000 architects and being a member of the House of Lords, Foster's journey is indeed extraordinary. Today's subject is also extraordinary, but for different reasons. To begin with, Rem Koolhaas's origins are not proletarian. They are bourgeois, middle class. In fact, his maternal grandfather was an important architect who built several headquarters for major companies in the Netherlands. As a child, Koolhaas had the opportunity, through his interactions with his grandfather, to become familiar with the world of architecture. His father, on the other hand, was a journalist and writer, very active in politics. Incidentally, he supported the cause of Indonesian independence through his writings. I mention this because Koolhaas was born in 1944 in a Rotterdam completely devastated by World War II, and he would spend part of his childhood in Indonesia. His father, who had shown much sympathy for the Indonesian independence movement, was offered an important position there, and they spent 4 years living in Indonesia. Thus, Koolhaas's childhood was initially Dutch, but then, between the ages of 8 and 12, it was Indonesian. This child then returned. He returned to the Netherlands and settled in Amsterdam, and from there, we will follow his career up to today. I ask you to keep this image in mind as it somewhat summarizes Koolhaas's condition, which is almost schizophrenic. He is an architect who wants to build and is always fighting with clients, losing many commissions precisely because his first reaction is to assert himself as the alpha male in any professional relationship. He is an architect who wants to build, yet he is also an intellectual who wants to translate what he builds into ideas. This leads him to sometimes complicated and often abrasive situations. He has a reputation for being a difficult person, someone who is rough and abrupt in his dealings, all of which is true. At the same time, he is a person with a certain tenderness and generosity in thought that few architects have today. He is the most influential theorist in contemporary architecture. If Foster is the builder and visionary, Koolhaas is primarily the intellectual and provocateur, and he has been so since his youth. This child who returns from Indonesia and this young man who begins to find his footing has to decide what he is going to dedicate himself to. In Amsterdam, His two passions are journalism and cinema, and he is torn between them. He doesn't think about architecture. He wants to be a journalist or a filmmaker. He is not quite sure, perhaps both. He starts by being a journalist and writes. From the age of 20, he writes for a weekly magazine on various cultural topics of all kinds. Only once do his reports and stories make it to the cover of the magazine, and it is precisely this one, an interview with Fellini. Here you have Fellini in the center with Koolhaas on the far right. During that interview, it was, let's say, the sweetest moment of his career as a journalist. He also managed to interview Le Corbusier himself, whom we previously compared him to shortly before Le Corbusier passed away. However, he barely remembers that. He says Le Corbusier would look to one side and say, "This is Vermeer's light," and to the other side and say, "This is Van Gogh's light." And that's almost all he was able to convey. But his journalistic career is soon overshadowed by his love for cinema. His fascination with cinema led him, along with a group of friends, to form a collective, which you can see here photographed. This collective went on to make a film, with Koolhaas primarily writing the scripts. As a man of letters and an intellectual, he wrote the scripts. He wrote several scripts for them, including one for an American filmmaker, now almost forgotten but very popular at the time, Russ Meyer, who made a kind of soft pornography. Koolhaas wrote a script for him, but it was never produced. In other words, he even wrote a script for Hollywood, which unfortunately, as I said, never materialized. But this is the world of this young student who is searching for his path, searching for his way. He does so as people did in that era, forming a group, like those bands that last a short while and then dissolve, like rock bands, just as we saw with Foster and Team 4, which lasted for a time until each went their separate ways. The same happens here. The group lasts for a while until Koolhaas says, "No, my true calling is going to be architecture. I will try something different, neither cinema nor literature." He enrolls at the Architectural Association, a British avant-garde school known for its very disruptive approaches. He spends 5 years here. He leaves Amsterdam and settles in London, which will become almost a second homeland for him. In fact, his future wife, Madelon Brissendorp, and their children have their home there. London becomes his second city. At the Architectural Association, he quickly fascinates his professors and classmates and completes his academic journey with an extraordinary project, one that is the seed of many things to come. It was a visionary project, almost difficult to understand. The Berlin Wall had just been erected, and everyone was wondering what would happen. The Berlin Wall had divided the city in two. It was impassable and seemed ominous. Koolhaas says, "What if we make it something positive?" He then invents this project called Exodus, or the Voluntary Prisoners of Architecture. In London, he proposes creating an enclosed space surrounded by 2 large walls, where inside they would create their own utopia. People would know that once they enter, they cannot leave. In other words, those who enter would have to be voluntary prisoners, but of a better, different world. It was a way to express that utopian thinking, and here he places it on the map of London. These are the 2 large walls he proposes to construct for this exodus, this stationary exodus, an exodus without moving, voluntary prisoners of architecture. But he soon embarks on his own exodus, a physical one, which takes him to the United States, because after all, that's where things were really happening. In the United States, he is fascinated by Manhattan. In fact, although he spends his first year there at Cornell as soon as he can, he moves to live in New York. He becomes affiliated with the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, which was then directed by Peter Eisenman. In Manhattan, over 5 years, the personality of Rem Koolhaas as an architect is truly formed and built. In Manhattan, among other things, he discovers what he calls the beauty of congestion. how living close together can be extraordinary. His first project in the United States is this one called The City of the Captive Globe. It is, once again, a surrealistic project. Here you see the captive globe surrounded by a series of blocks similar to the blocks of Manhattan, exactly the same, but each one builds upon it their dream, their subconscious, what they wish to express, but don't know how. On one hand, there is an element of regularity, a perfectly ordered grid, like the grid of Manhattan. However, just like in Manhattan, each building is topped in its own way, and in this case, even in a truly extravagant manner. He uses many references from the famous blocks of Le Corbusier to other completely surreal elements in their formless condition. He proposes it as an idea of how the regularity of Manhattan, that grid that seems to homogenize us, can actually make us free. Because that grid establishes the regularity of democracy, of order, and yet on it, each person can build their dreams. 5 years later, he completes this intellectual journey in the United States with another project that is also almost inseparable from his future as an architect, another utopian project. You might think these projects are not meant to be built. No one would imagine constructing two enormous walls or building a city where all the blocks are the same, but each roof is different. This one, even less so. This is the story of the pool, and it is indeed a parable, a narrative. He greatly admires the Soviet constructivists, as all young people of his age do. He has leftist ideology and seeks architecture in that moment of renewal that was Russia in the 1920s. This world fascinates the young Koolhaas. He invents a parable, which goes as follows. Some constructivists build a large swimming pool in the 1920s. When Stalin's regime arrives in the 1930s and persecutes these elements of renewal in language and architecture, they decide to flee. They decide to escape to the United States, and so, as they swim simultaneously, by action and reaction, the pool moves in the opposite direction. All of them, let's say, climb into this floating pool, and by swimming in the same direction, after 40 years, they arrive in Manhattan. It is a parable of arriving in Manhattan, and the American architects receive them with a certain amazement, partly because constructivism had gone out of fashion. On the other hand, these young people, when they arrive, say, "Ah, communism has arrived in America," when they see everyone dressed the same. They see the masses leaving the offices at 5 p.m., all wearing suits and ties, and think communism has arrived in America. They have created a completely homogeneous and egalitarian society. It was simply a way to express his love for that moment in history, and at the same time, how architecture can be renewed not only with works and projects, but sometimes with ideas, parables, and utopias like this one. His love for Manhattan ultimately materializes in a book that he will create with this other group of friends, similar to a rock band formed by Rem Koolhaas himself, as you can see here with his wife Madelon Vriesendorp, along with Elia Zengelis and Zoe Zengelis. These two couples, just like Norman Foster and his group, form what is called OMA, the Office for Metropolitan Architecture. The metropolitan in the name reflects their love for the big city, the metropolis, the New York they all admire. None of them are American. They are Greek, British, and Dutch. But they all admire Manhattan, and as I mentioned, they founded OMA. And here you have the four of them, with a lateral presence of what would become their main student, Zaha Hadid. She joined as a brilliant student, becoming part of this group of four, and they are the ones responsible for that book, authored by Koolhaas, but whose drawings were largely done by his wife, Madelon Vriesendorp, like this one you see here, and also by Zoe Zengelis. It is a collaborative book. Koolhaas didn't manage to write it during his 5 years in America. In America, he only gathered information, collected postcards, and accumulated material. When he returned to London, Invited by the Architectural Association as a professor, he had to give a lecture every week. Each week, he wrote a chapter, and in the end, he managed to create this book, Delirious New York. Delirious New York is one of the most influential books in the course of recent architecture. It is to Koolhaas what Towards a New Architecture was for Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier published his book in 1923 and changed the course of architecture. Koolhaas published this book much later, in 1977, and also changed the course of architecture. As you can see, the cover expresses that love for the metropolis through two reclining skyscrapers, the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building, the two great New York skyscrapers from the 1930s, but depicted as limp, like Dali's soft clocks. Why? Because this young man and all his entourage, all his friends, are already infected by surrealism. There was some surrealism in these parables, used by constructivists to talk about utopian constructions, but from here on, surrealism becomes more explicit. On one hand, there is the love for skyscrapers. As I mentioned, he collects postcards and eventually has 3,000 of them. Every week he goes to a place where postcard enthusiasts exchange them. It's a subculture, like the subculture of cartooners. He becomes a member of this subculture and goes every week to collect postcards. He says, "Sometimes I have found more information in postcards than in the city archives or other publications. The postcards hold the answer to New York." So, his response to New York includes, for example, how different moments generated the Rockefeller Center. Koolhaas accumulates all these things, and he organizes them into a narrative that later becomes the book. While he is in America, he only writes one article, just one, which he later incorporates into the book. That article is about this event, the Beaux Arts Ball, which was held in 1931 in New York, a ball that took place at the Astor Hotel with 3,000 people. The most renowned architects held a ball called the Skyline of New York. There you can see them, each architect dressed as their building, dancing in unison in front of 3,000 guests, forming the skyline of New York. You will notice they all wear the same attire except for one, William Van Allen, the author of the Chrysler Building. Here you see him. He created his own costume. He didn't want to, like the others, wear the little robe with squares that only represented one skyscraper and allowed them all to be the same but with different tops. He said, "No, I will be different from head to toe." His costume was extraordinary, made with precious woods. It is an incredible object that is still preserved today. And of course, his hat and cap were the spire of the Chrysler Building. Koolhaas wrote about this ball, about this form of architectural representation, and about that 1930s New York that fascinated him so much. He pointed out that there was only one woman at the ball. This woman was dressed as a wash basin. Why? It was a way to draw attention to the fact that architecture is not just about exteriors, not just about facades, not just about its outward appearance. Architecture also includes installations, the inner workings of a building, which are just as important as its exterior. Men don't think about these aspects as much, but women do. By extending the basin with the shape of a woman's breast and with two taps coming out near well, you can see it. She made not a humorous note but a critical one, highlighting the parade of self-satisfied architects dressed as their buildings. This was the only article Koolhaas wrote and incorporated into the book. The rest he wrote in London. But in London, he discovered elements that would later appear repeatedly in his career. For example, the New York Athletic Club is a building, an athletic club, where each floor has a different function. On one floor, there is a swimming pool. On the next floor, there is even a golf training area. And logically, there are facilities for boxing. It's an athletic club, as Koolhaas said, for metropolitan bachelors. He sometimes described these metropolitan bachelors as hedonists and at the same time as Calvinists, a unique combination of respect for external forms and sensuality in their way of living in the metropolis. Nothing expresses this better than these metropolitan bachelors, these hedonistic bachelors, these athletes eating oysters with boxing gloves. Of course, it is not very comfortable to eat oysters with boxing gloves, but again, it is that surreal touch of Koolhaas that conveys something about what New York means, about what the metropolis is. At the end of the book, and I dwell on it because it is so important in Koolhaas's career, he dedicates it to the two great European figures who arrived in New York and made it their own, almost boxing with it. One, of course, is Le Corbusier, who, when he arrived in New York in 1937, said that the skyscrapers were too small. He said, "These skyscrapers have no merit. They are too narrow. They don't fit." He arrives in New York, and of course, the New York Times puts it on the front page saying, "This great French architect arrives and tells us our skyscrapers are too small." The other is Dalí. But before Dalí, there is an intermediate step through Gaudí, and this hotel he designed for New York after a group of American businessmen visited him in 1908. Although I must say, to ease my conscience, that this is an apocryphal project whose authorship by Gaudí has never been completely validated. But as they say, se non è vero, è ben trovato, it could have been. This Gaudí-like project, which Koolhaas compares to the Eiffel Tower or the two skyscrapers of New York, is for him the project that should have been built in New York because it represents that Dalí-like condition of a soft, hairy, and sensual architecture. There is only one drawing that is repeated twice in Delirious New York, and it is this one, a drawing by Dalí, the only one that appears twice in the text because it represents what Dalí called a strategy of knowledge, a way of approaching the world. He called it the paranoiac critical method and said that one must let consciousness flow freely, without constraints, allowing the subconscious to emerge. Here, you see it as a kind of formless flow, supported by the crutches of Cartesian thought. This combination of the two elements permeates all of Koolhaas's thinking, which is deeply surrealistic, letting the subconscious flow and then applying the Cartesian grid, as in the project we saw earlier with the captive globe. The Cartesian grid represents reason and on top of it dreams, the unpredictable, the subconscious. When he finally manages to get projects and starts building his first project, the dance theater in The Hague precisely expresses those same ideas, fluid form sometimes trapped within a regular grid. The dance theater in The Hague not only aims to express geography with its forms, but also to convey something of what was in the young Koolhaas at the time, a certain love for the 1950s, that cheerful modernity, translated into the 1970s as a way of questioning the modernity of the era. This is a competition that Rem Koolhaas wins and builds immediately, giving him a certain level of popularity. This popularity is sufficient for an architecture editor, the owner of a magazine, to commission his own house from Koolhaas. This is a direct commission on the outskirts of Paris, and he builds it as a metal box, supported by a forest of very thin pillars. On top, you can see a fence like those used on construction sites, temporary, mixing those poor materials with refinement in the organization of the house. When it was unveiled, Koolhaas said, "My house is like a giraffe. It's like a head that rises to see Paris in the distance." It's on the outskirts of Paris, and to illustrate this, he brought a giraffe from the zoo to be photographed with it, showcasing his knack for publicity. Inevitably, the house made the front pages of newspapers, because a house with a metaphor right in front of it in the form of a giraffe from the zoo couldn't fail to capture attention. Of course, the house was eventually photographed in this way, again with a swimmer, similar to those athletes from the New York Athletic Club, or like the constructivist swimmers who swam tirelessly for 40 years. a swimmer, and the house, where only a small gesture can be noticed amidst the metal sheet, a nod to the 1950s towards a more cheerful modernity. And the house is also a homage to Le Corbusier, but to the more surreal Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier, who, incidentally, hated the surrealists, yet sometimes felt trapped by them. This is the Le Corbusier, who, for example, designed this rooftop for Beijing, where you see a rooftop with a fireplace and a completely surreal lawn. It could have been done in Mary-topping high. And then, like hanging a picture in a showcase, the views included the Eiffel Tower and the Arc de Triomphe. And Koolhaas's house does the same thing. In the end, in the background, the Eiffel Tower is placed as if in a magical still life. By then, he wins the most important competition because, in his own city, he wins the Kunsthal, a museum, or rather, an art center for exhibitions. Once again, he executes a very powerful idea. The building has 4 distinct facades, each facing a park, and the facades have different uses. With a deliberately trivial vision, a large billboard extends from it because you need to announce the exhibitions happening inside. And in the end, the image it presents might make one think it is more of a suburban train station than an art center. However, upon entering, the image is extraordinary because it is organized with various intersecting inclined planes. The chairs, each in a different color, introduce an element of joy and playfulness. Contemporary art, which was often seen as something very serious and sometimes excessively solemn, was starting to be understood in a different way. Koolhaas's approach was to desacralize it, but in another way, through these playful elements, both volumetric and chromatic. And sometimes with these interior views like the ones you can see here. By now, Koolhaas is an important figure in the world of architecture. His early works have been widely published, and he receives his first commission to work outside of the Netherlands. The commission comes from Arata Isozaki in Fukuoka, a region in Japan where Isozaki has many political contacts. He manages to invite a group of his talented, emerging architect friends to build housing, and Rem Koolhaas is one of them. Others include Stephen Hole and, interestingly, our own Oscar Tusquets, who was also an architect active in the architectural culture at the time. This is the moment when Olympic Barcelona is starting to take shape. Isozaki frequently visits Barcelona because he has projects there. Consequently, Tusquets also becomes part of this league of young architects invited to Fukuoka. He creates a housing complex that naturally integrates into the urban fabric. However, inside, he incorporates stylistic references to the cheerful modernity of the 1950s. His first residential work, he wouldn't do many more, was important for what it left behind and for its complexity. Speaking more for architects now, it was notable for its section and the way of approaching something that is often a trivial commission. Many architects simply see it as residential square footage, but Koolhaas tried to make even the least intentionally aesthetic commission something different. But Koolhaas thinks bigger. He is interested in large-scale projects and aspires to them. He competes, but does not win, a major project, the Parc de la Villette in Paris, to create a new park for the 21st century. The competition was won by Bernard Tschumi, who filled it with follies, incidentally, all painted red and inspired by constructivism. Koolhaas proposed this idea, illustrated here with a drawing by his associates and friends. And here with some of his own drawings, with an extraordinary idea that is again completely his, leaning towards surrealism. The idea is of functional bands. He says, instead of articulating the park with avenues, fountains, and Baroque arrangements, instead of designing it traditionally, I will simply divide it into slices. I will divide it into slices, and each slice will have a function. At first, this seems absurd, that the functions are merely placed next to each other instead of being integrated and organized. But he says, This is the method that Breton and his friends used to achieve beauty. In that game they played, called The Exquisite Corpse, as you know, they would gather and someone would write a word, cover it up, and the next person would write another word next to it. Then they would see what kind of combination was produced. This game, invented by Breton and practiced by all the surrealists, was called The Exquisite Corpse because the first time they played, the words corpse and exquisite were the result. These are two words we don't usually see together, but when we do, they give us a leap in imagination. This game of the exquisite corpse, through the use of bands, is what he employs for this competition, which he doesn't win, but which holds great importance in his work for Parc de la Villette. Koolhaas is thinking on a large scale. And large scale truly comes to him when he wins an extraordinary competition to build the new city of Euralille. The French high-speed rail, TGV, was to bifurcate in Lille, with one line going towards Brussels and the other towards the Channel Tunnel and London. Lille was to become a hub for high-speed rail. The historic city could not accommodate these new functions, so a new city had to be built next to the historic one, all serving the TGV. Rem Koolhaas then transfers these ideas of functional bands to this project. We've seen these ideas in the previous Euralille project, where he uses them to organize the city. He not only develops the urban plan but also assigns himself the largest building of all, the colossal Congrexpo, which you see here. He draws it next to the Eiffel Tower to show that it is as long as the Eiffel Tower is tall, an enormous building. He says, "I will do the master plan since I won the competition, and I will also take on the largest building." He then assigns projects to other colleagues such as Nouvelle, Port-Zam Park, and many others, but he takes on the largest building himself. And he does it with this strategy. The largest building had to have a conference center, a large exhibition fairground, and a grand performance center that the French call Zenith. Here you see the three in succession: the Zenith, the conference center, and the exhibition and fairground area. Normally, any other architect would have designed these three uses independently, giving each its optimal form and then trying to articulate them together. Koolhaas does the opposite. First, he draws a large oval and then slices it with two knife cuts, just as he had sliced Parc de la Villette into segments. He cuts it with two slices, as you can see, and the union of the Zenith, the conference center, and the exhibition areas is this. Here you see it in its place. This is the new Euralille, drawn somewhat like a comic, with the grand center, the Congrexpo, here depicted as an egg nestled in that tangle of highways and railways. Of course, the TGV line is the most important, but highways, other railway lines, and so on, also converge in this great communication hub, where he places his grand egg. He describes everything with a comic-like language. At one point he says, "I can't understand how a firm like mine was entrusted with a project like this. You can't understand it either. It's a small, inexperienced office that has built 3 buildings, and suddenly the French trust us to develop this. It is truly an extraordinary vote of confidence." And in the end, they effectively designed the fundamental piece, which you can see here in the model. And here it is, already under construction in what, as you can see, is a spaghetti-like tangle of roads and highways. And finally, here it is, fully constructed, as you can see. The two cuts are perfectly expressed. From here to the Zenith, this is the conference center, and from here starts the exhibition hall. It's a building that, instead of being articulated and connected, is designed in a single gesture and then fractured. And this is the summary. Once again, another exquisite corpse, another surreal building, but this time on a titanic scale. Venturing into large-scale projects, Koolhaas attempts to secure the biggest project of the time, what was humorously called, in line with the TGV, the TGB, the Très Grande Bibliothèque, very large library, or the National Library of France in Paris. As many of you might know, this project was ultimately won by Dominique Perrault with those 4 open books on the banks of the Seine. Koolhaas proposed a project, seen here behind in the model, that was truly surprising and extraordinary. A project so difficult to describe that instead of looking at the model, we need to look at the negative of the model. He proposed a large cube filled with books. He says, a cubic mass is a storage, a large cube filled with books inside which he would excavate the elements a library also needs: reading rooms, administrative areas, an auditorium, and these elements are excavated as you see here. What you see here as solid are the elements that in his project were empty, and what you see here as empty was filled with books. The succession of the floors is magical. This is a building where the successive floors are remarkable. A project of such boldness, even if it didn't win, had a significant impact. Just like with the La Villette competition, Koolhaas's project was more influential than the winning project by Tschumi. Similarly, he didn't win the Très Grande Bibliothèque, but Koolhaas's project was much more influential than the winning design by Perrault. And at this extraordinary moment for the firm, they propose unusual buildings, many of which, again, are not successful. For example, a conference center in Agadir. We are used to thinking that buildings are horizontal and that the roof must handle things like draining rainwater. In other words, buildings are flat plains with other things happening above them. Koolhaas does it the other way around. Things happen below, and it's a landscape of dunes with a flat roof. This is the Agadir project, a flat roof and a landscape of dunes underneath. You might say this defies all pragmatism because instead of moving horizontally, you would have to go up and down small dunes, likely thinking you might fall more easily. But in any case, turning the usual way of thinking about architecture inside out like a sock, this is yet another built project that has had an extraordinary influence. Another great library project by Koolhaas might make you think that he often failed because it was another project that wasn't built. However, it developed what Raphael Moneo calls the free section. He says, Le Corbusier and Mies invented the free plan. Koolhaas invented the free section. The free section is a concept where, instead of a series of floors connected by stairs and elevators, there is a single plane that ascends and folds over itself until it reaches the roof. He never got to build it, but his disciples at MVRDV, who had worked in his office, managed to construct a building like this before he did. However, he had planted the seeds of this idea in the people who worked with him. And when he finally does something similar to that free section, it is on a very modest scale, almost ridiculous. The Educatorium in Utrecht. Here, he indeed takes the roof, turns it upside down, and continues it with the floor, which you can see as the seating area of the Educatorium. It is essentially just a large lecture hall, a building of this kind. This gesture has been imitated a lot, but it is really just a small residue of that much more ambitious idea of the free section, where the entire building is a succession of interconnected planes. And after completing this, he achieves what would become the greatest publishing success in the history of architecture. A silver 4.5 kilogram tome called SML XL, like clothing sizes, but applied to his own architecture. He didn't present it by saying theaters, housing, etc. Instead, he categorized his work by small, medium, large, and extra-large sizes. He meant to say that these are the projects he truly enjoys, and indeed the book itself is XL, extra-large in size. The book sold 150,000 copies as soon as it was released, an incredible success. For me, Delirious New York is more important. A book full of intelligence, yet SML XL was a sensation. It contained Koolhaas's work, but not just his work. It included stories, comics, diaries, and statistics, making it a sort of international Bible. It encapsulates everything that had concerned him over the past few years. It took him 5 years to complete. He started the week after his father died and went to Canada to work with Bruce Mau, a great Canadian graphic designer who is also responsible for the book and is credited as a co-author. As you can see, Mau appears here alongside Koolhaas as a co-author of the book because in the end, it is a book created through design, through the presentation of things on the page. For Koolhaas, this was, in many ways, his popular consecration. He was already the most invited architect at architecture schools, the guru for all the young students, none of whom lacked S, M, L, XL on their shelves. Around this time, he received his second domestic commission, another house for an unusual client, but this time even more so because the client had suffered an accident and became tetraplegic. This house in Bordeaux had to consider that the client was in a wheelchair but still wanted to enjoy living in the house fully. Koolhaas designed a house that is both emotional and unsettling. As you can see, the house is elevated on a large column in an unstable equilibrium. He worked with engineer Cecil Ballmond from Arup, a firm known for its innovative engineering solutions. While Koolhaas himself may not have had extensive structural expertise, Ballmond enabled him to realize this type of aerial architecture. Ballmond's engineering prowess allowed for the creation of this house with its distinctive and seemingly unstable elevated structure. In this house, as you can see, there is a volume balanced on another, with the family's living areas in that intermediate space. However, the most important aspect is not that. The most important feature is this: a large platform that elevates, allowing the homeowner to access his library and move from one floor to another. This design helps him feel that he retains some mobility and is not exclusively confined to being an invalid. In this sequence of images, you can see how the platform with the office rises and integrates into the house. The story was so dramatic and the house was so spectacular that it became another hit in Koolhaas's career. These images have been reproduced endlessly. However, the house was used very briefly and precariously because the owner passed away soon after its completion. As a result, the platform had to be removed and made stationary. Everything that the house was designed to be, centered around a person in a wheelchair, transformed into something different very shortly after. In any case, the house is of such extraordinary complexity. There is a film I recommend about it called The House of Bordeaux, made by a pair of very intelligent documentarians. They chose to view the house not through the eyes of the owners or the architects, but through the eyes of the domestic staff, in this case, Guadalupe, the couple's maid from Extremadura. The documentary follows Guadalupe as she cleans this impossible house, full of inventions that constantly break down, with impossible stairs she has to climb with the vacuum cleaner. It suddenly shows how a house that was a kind of madness and a narrative around a disabled person turns into an absurdity worthy of modern times. The film, focused on Guadalupe, is reminiscent of Charlie Chaplin, as she tries to survive in this world of machines, windows that need to be cranked open, and controls that almost no one can easily decipher. But Koolhaas is still an architect who seeks to dazzle with a new idea in each project, always different, always aggressive, always in conflict with what we might think of as the usual world. By this time, he is sufficiently respected to build the Dutch embassy in Berlin. Berlin, as you know, became the new German capital after reunification. Foster had rebuilt the Reichstag to house the new parliament, and all the embassies in Bonn had to move to Berlin. In this area, by the canal, Koolhaas built a building that might seem almost trivial from the outside, a translucent cube, but inside, it's a total madness. It has a unique path that winds through it from start to finish. This can only be understood by looking at the floor plan. Yes, the floor plan shows the interior path of the building, From the outside, it appears to be a simple box, but inside, it contains a truly perverse and labyrinthine mechanism to reach the end. The building is uniquely special and, in fact, won the Mies van der Rohe Award that year. The execution is so meticulous and careful that, despite its conceptual madness and the grand itinerary that winds through it, it is crafted with such perfection that it's hard to find fault with it. Even Berlin, known for its conservative approach and the difficulty in obtaining building permits, was outmaneuvered by presenting it as an anonymous-looking cube. Inside, however, it was a box of surprises. However, the Guggenheim of 1997 changes architecture and also Koolhaas's work. In another episode, we saw how the opening of the Pompidou Center influenced Norman Foster's work, making him adopt a more sculptural architecture for almost a decade, where the structure appeared muscularly on the exterior, more expressionist architecture influenced by the Pompidou. In Koolhaas's case, the building by another architect that has this influence is Gary's Guggenheim. When Gary's Guggenheim opened, as everyone remembers, it was extraordinary. It became the first building since the Pompidou to have such popular impact, putting Bilbao on the map to a large extent. I say it changed the course of architecture because the success was not only critical, but also popular. The response was so great that many architects like Koolhaas, who were exploring experimental paths, realized that each new project had to be a tour de force, a scheme that surprised everyone. As a result, many architects, including Koolhaas, shifted their approach. They decided that if they wanted to survive as architects, they had to create icons, buildings with great exterior beauty but whose form was so recognizable that they would be inscribed in memory, memorable icons. If you think about the Dutch embassy we just saw, it's not memorable. It's simply a translucent cube by a canal. What is memorable about it? It's interesting when you dissect it, but from the outside, it's not. On the contrary, the Guggenheim had that memorable quality. It was very simple in its organization, a series of articulated boxes. However, its exterior skin, this storm of titanium, created an emotion and a surprise that architecture had not experienced in over a decade. Koolhaas changed his approach. He realized he had to stop these intellectual experiments, and if his office wanted to survive, and it was already quite large, he had to create sculptural icons. And the first, if the Guggenheim had been inspired not so much by its forms, though that too, but by the forms of the B-2 Spirit bomber, which was designed with the same software, CATIA, used to construct the Guggenheim. The Guggenheim could be built because aerospace industry programs had developed computer software that allowed the drawing and construction of very complex geometries. So indeed, the Guggenheim had a precedent in that invisible bomber, the Spirit bomber. However, Rem Koolhaas couldn't take the same reference and decided that instead of the bomber, he would take the fighter jet as his reference. The F-117 stealth fighter jet, another invisible aircraft, but one that was so unexpected in a world where you think everything aerodynamic must be very rounded. Instead, you see it with these angular folds that allow it to evade radar. This F-117 stealth was a technical object that fascinated architects, and Koolhaas was the first to decide that his future aesthetic had to be a stealth aesthetic. He coined the term stealth aesthetic, the aesthetic of the invisible fighter jet, and his first work in this style would be nearby in Porto, the Casa da Música, with that articulated folded aesthetic. The Casa da Música in Porto has an interesting and amusing story. The competition was announced. Before anything else, let me show you its location so you can get a sense of the type of structure it represents. It is clearly an icon, much like the Guggenheim was in Bilbao. It's a sculptural object of great beauty and construction, and at the same time absolutely memorable. If you've seen it once, You'll never forget it because it's unlike anything you've seen before, this faceted piece of such dimensions. And yet, it almost came about by chance. The coincidence lies in these hands holding models. It's 1999, and everyone is worried about the Y2K effect. Y2K stands for year 2000, a concern that many will remember, especially those who are not so young. It was feared that computers would stop working, planes would fall from the sky, and, in general, that the digital world would collapse because early software didn't account for the new millennium's digits. Newspapers were filled with stories about Y2K, predicting that the world, governed by our computers, would come crashing down at the stroke of midnight on January 1st, 2000. Thankfully, nothing happened, and we are all here today. But in the midst of that hysteria, a client asked Koolhaas to design a house called Y2K, reflecting this moment of global anxiety. He created this house, which you can see here, with a stealth aesthetic, because by then the Guggenheim had transformed the world, highlighting the need for iconic architecture. Then, Koolhaas was invited to participate in a competition for a music house in Porto, a grand auditorium with cultural uses. They gave the competitors 2 weeks to submit their designs. A dozen renowned architects were invited, but most declined, saying it was impossible to create a project in such a short time. In the end, only 3 accepted, including Koolhaas, who said, "I don't have enough time either, but I'll take this house I'm working on and change its scale." He transformed that same house, scaling it up to become the Casa da Música in Porto. And indeed, what was initially a house with its living room became the grand auditorium with its seating, simply by multiplying everything by 10. He thought, "I don't have time to create something new, but I need to present something." So, what he presented was the house, but scaled up. And here, you have the floor plans of the 2 successive projects, the Y2K house, which, by the way, when the Y2K problem didn't materialize and nothing happened, the client said, "Well, I've lost interest. There was no catastrophe." So he canceled the commission, and it was never built. It only existed as a project. But it served as the project that led to the Casa da Música in Porto. Koolhaas says, "Sometimes you might think it's cynical, but architecture can sometimes give birth to other architectures. This process of contamination, of parallel thinking, is present in our lives. We shouldn't be so strict about it, although there is a bit of cynicism in it. The house, even the Casa da Música, was made of glass because, like the other house, it was also meant to be glass. Imagine a glass building in Porto, right? Fortunately, the Portuguese engineers who worked with him persuaded him that it couldn't be made of glass and had to be built with concrete. They insisted it needed to be thermally efficient and protected from the climate. Thanks to these excellent engineers who worked with him, the project adapted accordingly. The Casa da Música is the extraordinary building we all know, where Koolhaas indeed added his own touches, of course. Among these touches is the surreal use of azulejos, ceramic tiles. The Portuguese tiles. When used geometrically on these terraces that open up to the landscape, they become playful. Koolhaas even incorporated historical and traditional azulejos, adding a layer of cultural richness to the design. But these tiles were cut, transformed, and used like a carpet in the building's representative areas. Once again, a great success, especially because Koolhaas had strategically understood what was happening. It was necessary to create icons, and he had delivered a very good one. So successful that when he entered the competition to design a major library in Seattle shortly after, he employed the same strategy. He didn't use the same materials, though. Here, as you can see, the materials are almost humble, like this kind of wood veneer. Koolhaas often delights in using ordinary materials, bold forms combined with banal materials. But then he includes experiments, such as this rear wall made of warped glass panels that are in front of which we have chosen to portray him. So when Koolhaas entered a new competition, he said, "Stealth aesthetic." The stealth aesthetic is fantastic, and indeed, with this aesthetic, Koolhaas won the competition for the Seattle Public Library and built a formidable building, a true icon. In the urban fabric of the city, it creates a landmark, a place of memory. If you need to meet someone, you meet in front of it. It's unmistakable. The modern city, with its anonymity, sometimes needs these objects. Some see them as an aggression, but others view them as the introduction of references that punctuate the otherwise anonymous cityscape. The interiors of the library are extraordinary, with large glass areas. In Seattle, in the northern United States near Canada, the climate is different. Here, he could do what he couldn't in Porto, make everything out of glass, with these extraordinary spaces and lighting. The program is also designed with great intelligence. As you can see here, it's a series of perfectly organized bands with specific functions, interspersed with gaps, and the interstitial spaces elevated to the level of architecture. He expressed the functions using this typography, which would later be widely imitated. And this is the final building, one that, of course, has... The interiors are exciting, and some say it looks more like an airport than a library because it's so large. But people love it. It's always full of people. Libraries are always successful, unlike museums, which are often empty and uncomfortable. You have to stand and pay. Libraries are free, you can sit, there are computers, and there's internet access. Libraries are always successful in the United States. When a building of this kind needs to be built, a specific budget must be made, and people have to vote. There needs to be a popular vote on whether they want this building. Whenever a new museum is proposed, people vote no, but when a library is proposed, people vote yes. Libraries are understood to be places for people. Interestingly, while we think of them as great places for study, they are more like colossal social centers. An artist created an installation in the lobby that shows what books are being requested at any given moment, what the librarians are providing to the users. It's very interesting because when you watch it for a while, you realize that people are mostly requesting low-quality books, comics, and such. You don't see anyone asking for serious literature. This is the central library of the Seattle Public Library system. What happens is that, at their core, libraries are large centers that serve the most humble segments of the population, offering heating and other services, and they are immensely popular. One noteworthy feature of the library is the carpets, not actual plants, but textiles with botanical motifs designed by Petra Blaise. Petra Blaise is very important in this story because she is a formidable designer with whom Koolhaas fell madly in love. He shares his house in Rotterdam with her from Monday to Friday, while his family remains in London, where he spends the weekends. Petra Blaise is one of those women connected to the textile world who are so important in architectural history but often overlooked. For example, Lily Reich, in the case of Mies van der Rohe, or Charlotte Perriand, in the case of Le Corbusier. Much of the interior design and furniture attributed to Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe should be credited to Lily Reich or Charlotte Perriand. Similarly, many of Koolhaas's interiors bear the mark of this woman, Petra Blaise. The most significant feature of the library, and the one I want to draw your attention to, is this book storage area, which, as you can see, is inclined, a ramped book depository. And I want to explain it better with this diagram. It is a continuous path that loops back on itself in the form of a ramp. And you can see here how one ascends via this ramp, accessing the shelves and books along the way. And the entire space features these pleasant colors, creating an inviting atmosphere. Even violent colors, but they make it very popular. Some say it's a mix of a daycare and an airport, but it's enormously popular, hugely popular. And this is its night view. Again, another memorable icon. The Casa da Música in Porto and the library in Seattle start to establish a distinctive style for Koolhaas, but he doesn't stop there. Around this time, he meets another extraordinary woman with whom he also has a very affectionate relationship, Miuccia Prada. Miuccia Prada immediately commissions him to design many of her stores. The most famous store, which many might have visited in New York, is the one there. There are others in Los Angeles and other places, but the New York store in Soho is notable. It occupies a former Guggenheim museum space. When the Guggenheim realized it wasn't working well, they gave it to Miuccia Prada, and Koolhaas designed this store, where, as you can see, the stairs are used to display shoes and other items for sale. And Koolhaas designed this store where, as you can see, the stairs are used to display shoes and other items for sale. But these stairs can also transform into a stage for music concerts or other cultural events. Although I've never seen this in person, only in photos, it's said that this urban feature can indeed be adapted for other uses. In any case, Koolhaas enters the world of brands and fashion, a world that might seem frivolous to architects but moves enormous amounts of money and has extraordinary publicity. Recently, I was reminded of this when I visited the Metropolitan Museum a month ago. There were several temporary exhibitions with modest attendance, but one had long lines, and I wondered what was so special that people had to wait 3 days to get in. It wasn't for Steve McQueen. It was for a fashion designer. As architects, we might look at this with some disdain, but fashion attracts spectacular crowds. The most demanded exhibition by far at the Metropolitan was for a fashion designer, not for Van Gogh or Vermeer. It's truly surprising but reflects the world we live in. Koolhaas, understanding this world of brands and fashion, connects through these projects with the Guggenheim and other high-profile venues. Koolhaas was commissioned to design 2 projects in Las Vegas. Who would have thought? One was for the Guggenheim Hermitage Museum, a collaboration with a Las Vegas casino to exhibit works from the Hermitage, the Great Russian Museum. As you can see here, it was designed as a large box made of Corten steel, and the interior looks like this. You enter through here, into this box attached to the casino, which, as you can see, is the most ostentatious thing imaginable. The Russians needed money, and the Las Vegas casino offered to pay a fee in exchange for 20 paintings from the Hermitage. Koolhaas designed this for them, and he also designed another, even larger project also in Las Vegas, and this one solely for the Guggenheim. The Guggenheim, already having a location in Bilbao, wanted another in Las Vegas. This is the Las Vegas branch of the Guggenheim, which was inaugurated with a motorcycle trends exhibition. The director of the Guggenheim, Thomas Krenz, was a motorcycle enthusiast, so they went with that theme for the desert setting. It was a great success initially, but had a short-lived impact. Koolhaas created this kind of reproduction of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, but in the Las Vegas style, a complete fiction and fantasy. These works bordered on camp and, unfortunately, had very short lifespans. Neither of the 2 projects is currently used for their intended purposes. This one is now a party hall, and the agreement with the Hermitage has expired, so these were short-lived projects. But, and here I am reaching the end of what I wanted to tell you, in the year 2000, Koolhaas was awarded the Pritzker Prize. The previous year, it had been awarded to Norman Foster, and the ceremony was held at the Reichstag in Berlin, completing a cycle. However, the Pritzker family felt guilty because, in these matters of high politics, they realized they had held a ceremony in Berlin before holding one in Jerusalem. So they decided the next ceremony would be in Jerusalem. Koolhaas resisted vehemently because, as an old leftist, he was reluctant to go to Jerusalem and implicitly endorse Israeli politics. However, he eventually complied and behaved well during the ceremony in front of the Western Wall. He received his Pritzker Prize, but shortly after something happened that changed our lives and the world. September 11th. So, what were we thinking about on September 11th? This is the cover of The Economist from the week of the attacks. We were discussing brands. The Economist even made a visual replica of the cover of Naomi Klein's No Logo and said, Pro Logo, supporting brands and globalization. This was the discussion on September 11th, and this is what Koolhaas wanted to propose as well. At that moment, the euro had been launched, and a firm had created this logo combining the yen, the euro, and the dollar, an investment firm. Immediately, Koolhaas decided to appropriate this idea and created his own yes, rotating the planet so that each letter corresponded to its geographic zone of influence. It was his way of saying yes to globalization, yes to brands, and yes to the glamour that many architects reject as frivolous. And unlike others, such as Adbusters, who created an American flag with corporate logos as a form of critique, Koolhaas took a different approach. When he received a vaguely defined commission from the European Parliament, he took it upon himself to create a visual identity for Europe. So he designs a new flag for Europe, which he calls the barcode flag. The barcode flag incorporates all the flags of the member countries into one, and his message is that Europe, at its core, is just that, a commercial union. It's not a political project, not a social project. We don't share the same language. It's exclusively an economic union. Therefore, the flag that represents Europeans is the barcode flag. And Koolhaas stated that Europe is nothing but the Europe of brands. Clearly, a goldmine for brands, not very well researched in this case by Koolhaas. As you can see, half of the Iberian Peninsula is represented by two brands, Arquitectura and Camper. There are no banks or other significant entities, making it somewhat absurd. Perhaps the other countries are equally absurdly represented, but we don't feel as equipped to reproach it. And don't think that Koolhaas has left this behind or repented. In the exhibition currently at the Barbican in London, the largest he's done in a long time, if you move among these cutouts that give the impression of always being crowded, you can see the walls. You can approach and see that he still maintains the same idea. In other words, the yes, the barcode flag, and the Europe of brands continue to be the elements he promotes as the legitimate way to represent Europe, rather than the stars and traditional symbols Europeans are used to. He organized a large exhibition in Brussels to persuade the EU authorities to adopt his new ideas. This is a bit of a contradiction. Koolhaas is an intellectual but doesn't reject the world of notoriety and glamour. He bitterly complains that since 1979, when Time dedicated a cover to Philip Johnson, no architect has been featured on the cover of Time. He says this is a disgrace and does so publicly. Here are all the covers Time has dedicated to architects with figures like Fuller and many others, and here is Frank Lloyd Wright. But he points out that the last one was Philip Johnson, and for 30 years, no architect has been given a cover. He probably thinks, when will they dedicate a Time cover to me? He has been featured in the New York Times and Wired, and he has also been featured in fashion magazines, so he can't complain too much. However, not having a cover on Time really bothers him. The same year he did all this, he was invited to a competition in Cordoba and won it by changing the rules. The jury, consisting of specialists and politicians, was seduced by his approach. The competition was for a conference center in Cordoba, and Koolhaas convinced them that the proposed location was terrible. He proposed a new location, arguing that the original site was a disaster and that everything around it was bad. He suggested a different parcel, which he invented as a slice of a park and said it was fantastic. From this new site, you could see the Mesquita. It was next to the water and near the park. Perfect. Normally, someone who changes the rules in a competition gets disqualified. But in this case, Koolhaas changed the rules and won the competition. He truly is a magician, a persuader. This is what he proposed. a very long building situated along the curve of the river, facing the Mesquita, as you can see, and interpreted in a graphically intelligent way. Notice how all the functions are placed one behind the other and then sliced. This extrusion-like building, then cut into slices, is a hallmark of Koolhaas's approach. But by then, politics had entered our lives since September 11th. He made a major exhibition in Berlin, accompanied by a publication that was his most important since SMLXL. While SMLXL was created with Bruce Mao, an exquisite Canadian graphic designer, this new publication was intentionally closer to the poetics of the more widespread comic book style. This is another of Koolhaas's great books. This accompanied his major exhibition at the National Gallery in Berlin, designed by Mies van der Rohe. He called it Content, where, as you can see, he displayed the two flags he proposed for the European Union, but he also proposed another one with letters, colors, and stars, as you can see there. And in this exhibition, of course, was the history of the world. Through diagrams, graphics, and collages, he presented the think tanks of the right and left, making an effort to map the intellectual, physical, and material world. This sometimes reached an extreme, becoming as confusing as the things done by consulting firms. But in many senses, it's also quite outlandish. It's true that we can't always tell if his interpretations of the world are as frivolous or superficial as his Europe of brands. However, what is certain is that OMA, as a think tank within architecture, has been the most productive in the world. These are some of the most notable architects who have emerged from Rem Koolhaas's office. You might recognize many names among them, such as Alejandro Zaire-Polo, Zaha Hadid, Winnie Mas, Farshid Musavi, Joshua Prince Ramos, Ole Sheeran, Bjarke Ingels, and Fernando Romero. All of these important architects share one thing in common. They spent part of their careers enduring the madness of working with Rem Koolhaas and being subjected to the unique environment of his office. Within this explosion of content and his vision of buildings as icons, he wanted to take it a step further and depicted all his buildings as little animals, animals that attack. Many of the buildings we've seen appear here in comic form. The one he was starting on at that time, and which I'll close this presentation with, was at the top. Do you remember? You see it there at the top, the CCTV Headquarters in China, which would become his third iconic building after Porto and Seattle. The headquarters of China Central Television is a building he proposed as a geometric donut shape, closed in on itself. The idea was to connect all the entities that form this vast conglomerate that is China's public television. Curiously, 100 channels under one company, which represents a single-minded perspective. This project has caused Koolhaas many problems. Every time he gives a lecture and shows this building, there is always a hand raised in the audience asking, "Mr. Koolhaas, how can you design a factory of single thought?" It's been one of his most controversial projects. However, he has defended it, suggesting that it's a building that serves as a gateway, an emblem, and even a feminine structure compared to more traditional buildings. Compared to the masculine buildings of the past. He and Madelon, his wife who made these drawings, have lovingly depicted it in bed, with soft, melting forms reminiscent of Dali's clocks. He mainly wanted to oppose this last generation of phallic skyscrapers, like the one by Jean Nouvel in Barcelona or the one by Foster in London, which he criticized as manifestations of masculinity. In contrast, he advocated for, "I propose a building similar to the one Peter Eisenman designed for Berlin, which never got built, the Max Reinhardt House." Peter defined it as a vaginal building in contrast to the phallic buildings. This is a vaginal building. Vaginal or not, the building has been completed and is spectacular in its form and dimension. For Koolhaas, it was a joyous conclusion to be able to build a skyscraper. Fascinated by New York, the metropolis, and the idea of congestion, he finally got to create a skyscraper even if it was in Beijing. And he did it as you can see in this scheme. With these sections, people can get an idea of the magnitude of the project. And these construction images show how things are done in China. We saw similar ones with Foster and the airport. And now we also notice how the entire foundation of the building is something truly titanic in its dimensions. But sadly, shortly before the inauguration, during the Chinese New Year ceremony, when they are fond of fireworks, one of the buildings, not the main donut-shaped building but the annex, burned down completely. It was a tremendous drama for the office. 3 years earlier, Koolhaas had been awarded the Mies van der Rohe Award and had come to Barcelona to receive it. He wanted to go to Madrid to see a building that was the only thing of interest to him there, the burned Windsor Tower. He said that seeing a skyscraper destroyed by flames is an extraordinary spectacle. It was almost premonitory of what would later happen to his own building. However, in this case, unlike the Windsor Tower, it wasn't necessary to demolish the building, and it has been happily completed. This is the building you see here in the foreground, and it has been successfully completed in Beijing, with its inauguration happening gradually. It didn't make it in time for the Olympics, which was the original goal for its construction, but in the end, it is there, joining other projects of his, such as the one he is currently doing at the Shenzhen Stock Exchange, and many others in China. The office is now doing all these projects with the same intention of creating buildings that are sometimes almost anonymous, almost generic, taking their reference. Many might think that these grand lights and this boldness somewhat reference Japanese metabolism. Incidentally, Koolhaas has dedicated a book to Japanese metabolism recently, which I recommend because it is very interesting. He describes it as the last avant-garde and the first great non-Western avant-garde. From 1960 to 1985, with figures like Kenzo Tang and Kisho Kurokawa, they did truly remarkable things. He now believes they are like the revived constructivists he has found in Japan, where some of the original members are still alive. However, it must be said that where he has been able to materialize his dreams in a more radical way is not in the Asia where he lived as a child, but in the Gulf. In the Gulf, he has a sequence of projects that I will quickly show you. None of them have been built yet. They are just projects, but they are worth seeing to understand the mindset of our man. In Dubai, he was commissioned to design a skyscraper. Given that he couldn't compete with the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, he decided to do something different. He proposed it as a slab in the middle of an artificial lake, continuously rotating on its axis. He wanted to create the engineering to make the building constantly move. He was asked to design a new city in Ras Al Khaimah, and he proposed this. You may remember Foster's design, proposed the same year. There were accusations of industrial espionage, and while they are quite different, both designs featured the same square element. Koolhaas's vision included this sphere as the visionary element. This sphere is present in many of his projects. Finally, in Dubai, he started another project, now halted due to the financial crisis. The real estate crisis in Dubai, as you know, has been extraordinary. Again, it features an island with a square profile and another sphere as the reference and identity element. Spheres have always obsessed him because he associates them with revolutionary architecture, like the French revolutionary architecture of the 18th century. An example is the gardener's house by Ledoux at the Saline Royale in Arc-et-Senans, or the Russian revolutionaries like Leonidov with the Lenin Institute, or even the American visionaries. Like in this 1909 project, which until now he had only been able to realize, yes, even more so. In the 1939 New York World's Fair, the Perisphere was presented as a grand exhibition hall in spherical form. Koolhaas takes this as a reference for his own designs, which, until now, he had only been able to realize at the Serpentine Gallery in London. When they proposed he design a pavilion, he proposed this inflatable sphere. But at its core, the one he truly wants to build is this one he has proposed in Dubai. This kind of Death Star like the one from Star Wars. But inside, it faithfully reproduces the one he designed. Gerd, the most daring developer on the planet, in Fukuoka, the city where he had his first international commission. In the end, what happens? Some young Germans have expressed the current state of architecture like this. On one hand, cities are becoming increasingly disordered, more chaotic, more banal and vulgar. Yet architects are becoming more famous and more like stars. They depicted this with a montage where the rock band members were all Rem Koolhaas, symbolizing the quintessential famous architect. This reflects a somewhat bitter view of the current moment in architecture, where architects have never been so popular yet so incapable of truly shaping the city. This is what I want to end with. A recently unveiled project by Koolhaas, a convention center in Toulouse. It embodies the same approach as when he placed a giraffe in Villa dall'Ava for photographers. Now, he says, my convention center is so large that giraffes, elephants, and hippos can come in, whatever it takes. This is his way of expressing the magnitude of his proposal. And what he proposes is indeed a gigantic, immense building that never seems to end, once again featuring a sphere at the end, his own particular Death Star. And it extends over the landscape, as you can see here, exactly as he did at the beginning of his career. The project we saw earlier, Exodus, or the Voluntary Prisoners of Architecture, is exactly the same concept, an endless strip that rises above the landscape. And in the end, as you can see, it disappears into the landscape. This is, in the end, the final episode or the last stop of this journey that began 40 years ago in Amsterdam. A young Rem Koolhaas who hesitated between cinema and literature and finally decided on architecture. Rem Koolhaas. And so, we've come to the end of this journey, tracing the remarkable career of Rem Koolhaas, from a young man in Amsterdam torn between cinema and literature to becoming one of the most influential architects of our time. His works, whether in Porto, Seattle, Beijing, or the ambitious projects in the Gulf, showcase his unique vision and daring spirit. Koolhaas has never shied away from challenging conventions, always pushing the boundaries of what architecture can be. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of his legacy. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the world of architecture. See you in the next episode.